provision that was included in December inside the 1,576-page National Defense Authorization Act of 2017, which was of concern to me, and I hadn't had quite the time to examine it before we got on the air. Remember that the war on free speech, and especially on the independent media, was going to ramp up. I've been predicting that for well over a half a year because I said they just cannot let this thing go forever. So they've got to find some way to start interrupting it. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Loeffler here with you. We have heard nothing but hysteria over, quote, fake news. All of a sudden, everybody's concerned with fake news. Fake news is what got Donald Trump elected. And the other, of course, is that Russia hacked into our electoral process, and that's the problem as well. And once you start seeing things, okay, you start watching this momentum building, you can be assured that there is an agenda underfoot. It's underway, and the claims that they're making are simply the claims, the for public consumption things needed to push legislation, regulation through that aims to get rid of the problem that they have perceived. And the real problem is independent media, both in Europe and Great Britain and the United States, that have caused radical changes in recent elections, not by presenting fake news, but by presenting the news that the standard media refused to cover. I want to talk to Alex Newman again, bringing him back. He's a correspondent for The New American, and last week we were talking about education, but he wrote a very good article on what some people are calling a new Orwellian ministry of truth inside of our government. Critics slam Congress for creating an Orwellian ministry of truth. First of all, people need to understand, Alex, when things are buried inside a huge mega bill like the National Defense Spending Authorization Act, it winds up getting passed. So if you can get the mischief into the bill, you can't oppose the mischief because the big bill has to pass in order to fund the military. So that's why it was done the way it was done.
You're exactly right about the strategy they pursued here. They knew that this would never pass if it were to be voted on its own, because it's self-evidently totalitarian. Because what it does is it establishes this, the legislation calls it a global engagement center, and it's going to bring together a whole wide range of bureaucracies, Department of Defense, Department of State, the whole works, and they have a number of goals as defined by the legislation. They're, first of all, supposed to promote media that promotes the U.S. foreign policy agenda, and it's just stated explicitly in the legislation. So another way of saying that is this bureaucracy is going to be in charge of disseminating and financing government propaganda, literally. I mean, this is actual propaganda aimed at promoting the viewpoint of the bureaucrats within the U.S. government and the influences behind those bureaucrats. And they state this explicitly. They talk about providing funding for so-called journalists and media organizations that parrot the party line. There's no requirement in there that so-called journalists disclose the fact that they're being funded by the federal government to promote U.S. government propaganda. And then on the other side, it's charged with counteracting and fighting against so-called fake news and Russian propaganda and so on and so forth. Now, that's not to say that there is no such thing as Russian propaganda. There certainly is. The RT network, which I've actually been on a number of times, is quite truly a Russian propaganda organ, just in the same sense that the BBC is a British propaganda organ, and just in the same sense NPR and some of these other U.S. government-funded so-called media outlets are U.S. government propaganda organs. And it so happens that at this stage you actually get occasionally a fair amount of truth on Russian propaganda outlets, probably because they're trying to build up credibility. But to have a U.S. government bureaucracy charged with waging a propaganda war is really opening up a can of worms that we really never had in this country, and I can't think of anything good that's going to come out of this.
Now, we're not talking about them blocking stories at this stage of the game, but at this moment, they're what? Just going to create stories that then I'm sure they're going to have their shills in the mainline media that will republish a lot of this stuff.
Well, that's exactly, I think, what the goal is here. They want to start putting out propaganda that gets parroted and repeated by other media organs. And, there has been some of this in the past. A lot of it was covert. The CIA, for example, ran Operation Mockingbird, where they were trying to infiltrate the news agencies and get their propaganda out there. But this is really, as far as I know, the first overt effort to produce propaganda aimed at the American people and other people around the world. And you're right, there's not going to suddenly come out tomorrow, like Communist China has the Great Firewall of China, where they're going to say, well, we don't want you to read that news, so it's actually banned in the whole country and nobody can access it. But it's a troubling step in that direction in the sense of being a ministry of truth. I mean, the idea here is to supposedly help the American people distinguish between true news and fake news, as if the government and the so-called establishment media were not disseminating fake news on a regular basis, and it's supposed to directly promote the U.S. government's propaganda line. And so I think that's the real danger here, is that you're intermixing government propaganda with legitimate news, and people aren't going to have any way to tell the difference. And then there's the whole other side of this coin, where they're going to start building databases of journalists who they suspect of being a fake news or Russian propaganda or anything like that. And the implications could be very, very troubling.
And so the real question is, who determines what the fake news is? Now, according to places like YouTube and Facebook and whatever, they're going to refer to that harbinger of wonderful journalism, Associated Press, or say, for example, ABC News. But these are exactly the ones that the independent media counter.
That's right.
So one side gets the blessing, the other side gets the curse.
That's right. And, I have a feeling this is going to blow up in their faces and backfire in a major way. Just very recently, we had a stunning example of the definition of fake news. For some of the listeners remember, there was 4 black people in Chicago who kidnapped a mentally challenged Trump supporter and tortured him and made him drink from the toilet and sliced his scalp and burned cigarettes on him and made him say, cuss words about white people and Donald Trump. And CBS came out and they said that the way they framed the story gave the impression that this was for white people who had kidnapped a black mentally challenged teenager and tortured him. And it was a stunning example of deception. And I think this kind of stuff has really caused the American people to wake up. And if you look at the polls, they show this. Just at the end of last year, there was a number of polls that were coming out from the Associated Press, from Gallup, and some of these. And something like 6% of the American people still have a great deal of trust in the media. I think less than 15% of Republicans have any trust in the national media anymore. So, this is all taking a toll. These people can keep pushing the propaganda through their propaganda organs, what used to be known as the mainstream media. I call it now the globalist fringe media. But it's not going to work with the availability of alternative media. Yeah, they can call it fake news. They can use their hacks over at Snopes.com to pretend like facts aren't facts. But it's having its toll. They're losing their credibility to the point where these days, if CNN or CBS or NBC tells you that the sun is shining, you're going to go out and look at the window. Is the sky really blue? Is the sun really shining? I'm not going to believe them. And I think that's the corner they've painted themselves into, and they really don't have any way out now. Yeah, they're hollering fake news, but people have already caught on to the scam.
Well, not only that, but even the newspaper of wreckage, the New York Times, has been caught in some real whoppers. Remember the thing on gun rights with Katie Couric? She asked this question, and then they did cutaways where everybody's just sitting there and looking. These are standard stock cutaways that you do when you're doing a setup for an interview like that. But the way the cutaways were put in there is it made it look like she had asked a question that had stumped all of the panelists.
Yep.
That when in reality, they began responding right away. And then she said, oh, well, that was for artistic effect. And I go, I've edited enough video in my career. I know exactly what you were doing.
That's right. And, if we go back to the New York Times, the New York Times has been doing this for many, many decades. We can go back to Walter Duranty, who did his best to paint Stalin as this kind of wonderful guy, did his best to conceal the ongoing genocide of Ukrainians at that time. They starved about 10 million Ukrainians to death, and Walter Duranty said, oh, no, it's all lollipops and rainbows, nothing to see here. Then you had, of course, Herbert Matthews, who said, Castro is definitely not a communist. He's a freedom fighter, and he's like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So, back then, people didn't have an alternative media to realize that this was all lies. Eventually the truth came out. Castro declared himself to be a communist. But at the time, Americans didn't have a Drudge Report or a Breitbart or an InfoWars or the New American or any of these to go to and say, is this really the truth? Let's compare. Let's look at another perspective. And all media outlets will have an agenda, right? The New American states its agenda right on the webpage. We support the Constitution. We support American liberties. So in that sense, I think the New American is very honest about it. Yes, we have an agenda. We like the Constitution. We like our freedoms, and we'd like to keep those things. Whereas the New York Times presents itself as this impartial arbiter, when in fact it's nothing of the sort. It's actually one of the most vicious propaganda organs, and even some of its people have come out and said this. There was a reporter who resigned a few years ago, and he said, hey, the New York Times is actually a propaganda megaphone for war, for the establishment, and for pushing all these attacks on regular people. And so, I think as time goes on, the few remaining people who still trust the media are going to eventually wake up. It might not be tomorrow, but eventually they'll come across a story. They'll say, hey, I know that's not true. I know this is presented in a misleading way, and this is not going to be able to continue. So I suspect the establishment will get more and more radical, but I really don't see how they can work themselves out of this.
Then the next question is, well, what would be the efforts to shut this down? Well, in the private sector, of course, this is this new idea about fact-checking. Remember the issue over death panels in Obamacare? And somebody could fact-check and say, well, there are no death panels in this bill. And I go, well, yeah, but there are already provisions here for decision-making organs within it. And we know from the structure of it, not everybody's going to get the health care they want. So if you follow this chain through, it's going to result in death panels sooner or later. So you could technically say, well, that's not a fact. You and I both know that politics is always couched in half-truths. So that's why I'm really even suspicious of YouTube and Twitter and everybody successfully pulling this off. But they're under a lot of pressure from the European Union right now. Europeans don't have the same respect for freedom of speech that we do.
That's right. And, I think it's very troubling that all the big tech companies have joined forces with the European Union, which is an unelected, unaccountable monster that, has no respect for the will of the people. They've joined forces to start censoring the Internet. And I think that is really one of the dangers, because if you talk to people who fled from the Soviet Union or who fled from Cuba or who fled from some of these dictatorships where the government just outright censors and outright publishes its propaganda in state-owned newspapers like Pravda and Granma and these kinds of things, everybody knows that this is phony. People read it and they know that this is the party line and that it's not true. And if there is any truth, it's very misleading anyway. But the danger is, in the United States, people always assumed, hey, we have a free press. They wouldn't lie to us. And if they did do that, well, we would hear about it on TV. But I think that misconception is slowly giving way. But I think there is a danger in companies like Google, for example, and they've already started doing this. They've started editing and altering their algorithms to downgrade things that they don't like. And they're starting with stuff that's, rather nasty. They're going to push down Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. And no one's going to say, oh, well, we love anti-Semitism. We don't want you to change your algorithm. But the danger is, they'll start with this kind of stuff, and then they'll move on to things that are true. And you see this in countries like Sweden. I spent a very long time living in Sweden. One of the things that was, I think, to me the most amazing is that these hate speech laws. What happened in 2008 was the Justice Ministry came out and they did an investigation of the Bible. They said, hey, is the Bible hate speech? And they did their investigation, and they concluded that, oh, yes, actually it is hate speech. It's a violation of our laws. It's probably not practical to ban it at this point. But that's where this is all going, to the point where they're going to use laws to try to censor truth, the actual truth. And so I think that's a big danger. And, with these social media networks and with Google and all these things trying to manipulate people, I think that's really a very big danger that we're facing.
All right, Alex Newman with the New American correspondent for that, covering economics, education, and politics. Also, as I mentioned last week, had co-authored a book with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. As they make moves in this direction, the yapping and howling is going to get even bigger from people who are pointing out that that's what this basically is, censorship. And that's what we should be doing.
Yeah.
Anyway, I appreciate it, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Take care, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Coming up next,